So this week we're going to continue with looking at the Dublin core metadata schema, and we'll be looking at the second half of the group of elements. Again, this week, in addition to the YouTube video that you're listening to now, there's a complete version of the notes in this week's module. And so rather than putting it in leaving it as a PDF in PowerPoint where you have to click on the little call out at the upper left corner that works for some of you but doesn't work for others, I just went ahead and had it basically create a PDF of a Word doc so that you have the full notes, and hopefully they'll be easier for everyone to be able to look at and to review. So the first element that we're going to take a look at is rights. And of course, this is information about the status of copyright for that particular work. If it is still protected under copyright, who owns that copyright, and what uses may be made of that material. So it is going to be more than just the copyright status. When you're entering content creation, there's several different strategies that institutions use. The one that I would recommend is that you include some kind of textual statement in the record, perhaps just a brief version of what might be the full right statement. So in other words, you may say in the metadata record that all rights are reserved by a particular institution, and include in that a link, a URL pointing to a rights statement where there would be more complete information about who owns that copyright, again, what the copyright status is, and how and if the material may be used. So it's, the Dublin Core, if you go to their site, as you see on the screen here, they say you can use either a textual statement or a URL that points out to something else. I think the URL is fine, particularly if you have a very comprehensive right statement that you want to link to, and it's a common one that you use, say, for all materials in a collection or everything, all of your digital collections. But I think it's important in the metadata to also include some rights information rather than just a link, because we know what can happen to links. So we are going to look at some examples of right statements that illustrate some of the problems that we have with image rights within metadata records. The links are provided for you here, but we're going to take a look at, I don't know, the first 5 together now, and of course they're going to be on slides. So in this case, we have a photograph, and this is from USC. Notice that in the right statement, the only thing they have listed is University of Southern California. There's also there is some contact information in that there is information about how to physically, to access the physical collection. So you could contact them there, but it doesn't really say if you can do anything with this image. All it tells us is that the University of Southern California has made some kind of claim to it. So in this case, what we're looking at is a postcard, which, if you look at the record, it doesn't give you a date of creation. So you really don't know exactly when this postcard was created, but if you look at the subject headings, it's from World War I. It's World War 1914 to 1918. Well, again, I have to question if this was actually created prior to 1923. In their rights statement, they say that the images are to be used for educational purposes only and are not to be reproduced without permission from the campus. Well, if it's in the public domain, it's in the public domain. And and basically what they're trying to do is, number one, to limit use of this to educational purposes only, but then to also say that you can't reproduce it without their permission. Now, as we'll see in, I'm not sure if it's the next slide or the two forward, there is a way that you can ask for credit for making the digital version available, but you can't really claim copyright to it. But it looks to me as though in this case this is what they're doing. So yes, this is the one that out of the group, this is probably the best record as far as I'm concerned. It tells us that materials published by the U.S. government printing offices are in the public domain and as such not subject to copyright restriction. However, the library requests users to cite the URL and Northwestern University Library if they wish to reproduce images from its poster database. So all they're saying is, please give us credit, please cite us for the work that we have done. But they are not claiming copyright to either the original or to a digital version of the original. So this one I thought was very interesting. So this is a relief of Abraham Lincoln, and the date is 1885 of the original relief. But what caught my eye with this one is it's very common for institutions to link to a standard right statement that they'll use for the majority of their collections. So they'll give you a URL, and then you go out to that URL and it gives you rights information, it gives you use information, which is all very helpful and all very good. But in this case, what they're doing is they are giving you in the rights field information about how to order a reproduction. Well, what if I don't want to order a reproduction? What if I just simply want to download it or to make a copy of this in some way? I don't know what I can do with this because the record's not telling me. All it's basically telling me, or it's giving me, is information about how to order a copy from them. So in this case, I found this one rather confusing. So this is, this record is for a postcard, and I believe the postcard, I'm not sure when the postcard was created, although I think it may have been created in 1987, but the postcard is of a film, and the film was made in 1947. But I think clearly what we're talking about here is a postcard. But this rights statement, I also thought was interesting. So this item has been made available for use in research, teaching, and private studies. Researchers are responsible for using these materials in accordance with Title 17, the copyright law, and any other applicable statutes. But here's the kicker. If you are the creator or copyright holder of this item and would like it removed, please contact us. Well, what are you doing putting this up and claiming copyright to it if in fact it's not clear that you have any rights to it at all? So quite ambiguous. Okay, but here's what you need to know. Here's the other piece of information you need to know to kind of put this in perspective. They did a survey, this has probably been 2 or 3 years ago, and they looked at 768 digital collections at 29 different institutions in which the authors of the study were looking for copyright statements on digital collections. Big surprise, there was not a single institution that did not have at least one collection for which there was no copyright information. And in the list of sites to look at, the last link that you have there is for a digital image for which there's no rights information at all. You don't know what you can do with it. And I believe there's also no contact information, so you don't know who to ask. So these are the kinds of issues that we find with rights statements field. So I just want you to be aware of these when you are creating your own metadata for this. So here are some recommendations as to best practices when entering information in the rights field. The first one is to make sure that the copyright status, if it is still protected under copyright, that it's clearly stated in the record. And the same is true if it is also in the public domain, state that. Sometimes you're going to have items within a collection that their copyright status may be different from other items in the collection. And so in those situations, you have to be very careful that you're giving the correct information about an image. So if you have an image now that is in the public domain and everything else has been pretty much copyright protected, you want to make sure that that's clear in the record, that this one is in public domain and may be used. You also want to clearly indicate who the copyright holder is. And if you don't know, then say so. And then lastly, you want to make sure that it's very clear to the end user what the legal uses are regarding this particular image. Now, if you're reserving some of the rights, not all of the rights, and you are the owner of the copyright, you can certainly do that. And you can, restrict certain kinds of uses. That's certainly within your purview to do that if you do own the copyright, but just make sure that that's clear in the record. So here's an example of a right statement. So this digital image is from a collection of cabinet cards that are in the public domain. These images are available for download, printing, and all other forms of reproduction. So this really is a use statement. This is what can I do with this material. Now, remember that there are some, in Qualified Dublin Core, there are some additional elements that really refine the rights statement, and one of those is access rights. And so it's basically information about who can access the resource or an indication of its security status. And we have an example here. Under access rights, viewing of the images in this collection is limited to the Internet Protocol address range for the Shatford Library. So this collection has been restricted in some way. It could be that this is material that is covered by copyright but has been digitized for preservation purposes. And remember that if it's been copied for preservation purposes, you cannot make it available on the general web. Basically, they would have to come into the library to see it, or it has to be very tightly controlled. The next qualifying element is rights holder, and of course that's the person or organization owning or managing the rights over the resource. And the sample you have here is rights holder. The copyright for the photographs in this collection is owned by Pasadena City College Shatford Library. And I would suggest as well that if you don't have a separate contact field, that the contact information gets included in the rights holder, or going back up to the simple Dublin Core element, the rights field, so that that information is in the record. So we're going to switch gears a bit here, moving out of rights. We're going to talk about the Dublin Core element type. So think back to the discussion that we've had a couple times over the last few weeks about the content, the intellectual content of, say, that photograph versus the carrier or the container. we have the intellectual content, which is frequently referred to as the work, and then we have the carriers of that work. And a lot of times what I've been talking about are different file types. So we have the original photograph, we have a JPEG, we have a TIFF. The JPEG and the TIFF, of course, are the carriers of that work. The type element is used at a very broad level to provide information about the nature or the genre or the general kind of content of that intellectual resource, of that work. And when I say broad, broad categories, I mean broad like text, moving image, still image. So there aren't a lot of values for this field, and they again are very, very broad. Now, in a collection that consists of only, say, one type of resource, the value of including this element, you might question, why do we have to put this in every record? But if you think about this collection being cross-searched, so searching it across multiple collections, and those collections might have different types of, they might be different resource types. So thinking back to the example that I gave you a couple of weeks ago about Louis Armstrong, if I want to search for everything about Louis Armstrong, if I include something like I want to see images, well then that'll allow me to pull together across, say, a collection of photographs, a collection of musical files, so a variety of types of material all relating to Louis Armstrong. This, using the type format, will allow the system to pull together everything about Louis Armstrong that might be, in fact, those, excuse me, just the photographs of him. If you think about, again, this collection being cross-searched, so across collections, along with other collections that you might have of various types of materials, and the metadata also being harvested and aggregated by an outside agency, the value of this element then becomes much more apparent. This is one of the most important ways by which users typically want to browse or to limit or refine their searches to particular types of content. All metadata schemas, including, of course, Dublin Core, and best practice guides agree that resource type should be taken from a controlled vocabulary. It is critical, particularly for this field, that the values entered into this element be consistent if they are to function for search limits, but also for browse categories and even hyperlinking. Now, the vocabulary that is generally recommended for use with this element is called the DCMI type vocabulary, and what that stands for is the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative type vocabulary. Now, you looked last week at the Dublin Core website and you saw some very general but technical information about the creation of Dublin Core. Well, if you go back to that site, you'll see that there are links there to this type vocabulary. So here are the terms that are used in the DCMI type vocabulary. There's basically 2 slides, and there's a total of 3, 4, 5, 6, about 11 different appropriate values. They include collection, dataset, event, image, and interactive resource, as well as moving image, physical object, software, sound, still image, and text. Now, instances of the type moving image must also be describable as instances of the broader type image, and the same thing is true of still image. So if you're using still image, it would also be appropriate to use image. Notice that when we're talking about text, that facsimiles or images of text, those are still considered to be the genre text. It doesn't move to images because it is, say, a digital representation of that text material. Okay, so now in contrast to type of resource, which we just discussed, which usually indicates the kind of generic characteristics of the intellectual content of a resource, most of the schemas out there also include one or more elements for recording more specific format characteristics, such as the specific physical material, the medium of which the resource is made. There may be specific physical size or dimensions or measurements. If we're talking about film, it could be the duration. It could be playing time for audio. Now, for the most part, these all have to do with the characteristics of the carrier of the intellectual content. So we're talking about basically a manifestation. Depending upon what your metadata record is describing, this field could include terms like, color slide, 35 millimeter, 17 minutes, audio / MP3, image / JPEG or image / GIF, and so on. Well, some of the metadata schemas, and a common one that is out there, Visual Resources Association schema, they include elements like measurements and material. In Dublin Core, this information would all be included in the format field. So you could expect to see a wide variety of information about the physical and or the digital characteristics of a resource. Now again, with format, just as with type, the recommended best practice is to use a controlled vocabulary. There is one called the Internet Media Types, which is MIME, and that's one I believe I pointed some of you to during Library 121 when you were creating your metadata records. There's also the Art and Architecture Thesaurus that contains a list that you can use. And there are links to those. They're at the bottom of the screen. Now, if you were using Dublin Core to describe a physical collection, say a photograph, for type, this would be an image. In the format field, if you're describing the physical photograph, you might enter 8 inches by 10 inches. If instead we're describing a digital representation of that photograph, then our type would again be image, but the format would be image / JPEG or image / TIFF. Still images for both the original work as well as this digital version or manifestation. We say image, but then we include a / and then the file type, and that's the standard format for entering file types in the format field. Okay, so this kind of lays it out, or what I was just talking about lays it out for you on the slide. So type, for describing a physical photograph, type is image, format would be 8 by 10, the size of the container. And a scanned photograph would be, you could use image, because remember that is one of the values in the controlled vocabulary that we would use for this field, but even more precise would be still image, and then the format would be image/JPEG. Okay, next we're going to look at the Dublin core element coverage. And remember, this element came up back when we were talking about dates. And I told you to be careful when you're entering information in the date field that you don't put in information about a period of time or a date as to when, if it was of an event. Let's say it's a fashion show in the Edwardian period, you wouldn't enter that information in the date field, you would enter it in the coverage field. Coverage has to do with subject. So spatial topic as well as spatial applicability, this can be a named place or a location, and oftentimes it's specified by its geographic coordinates. Temporal, on the other hand, this of course is going to be a named period, a date, or a date range. But again, remember that coverage has to do with the topic of the resource. It does not have to do with when the original intellectual property was created. So again, temporal, a named period, date, or date range. If you're using a period, you want to use a controlled vocabulary. LCSH, the subject headings list we looked at last week, that would be perfectly appropriate. But you'll also notice that there are other controlled vocabularies that you can use. Certainly, in addition to LCSH, you can use, for spatial things, you can use the Getty Thesaurus of Geographic Names. Then there is also the Library of Congress Name Authority file. These, again, would be resources that you would want to consult if you're entering spatial information. If we're talking about temporal or time, then you would want to look at the AAT, Art and Architecture Thesaurus, as well as Library of Congress subject headings. Now keep in mind that some time periods, I mentioned Edwardian, and some of those periods of time that we give a, a label that is a word. You can also use a date in these fields if you're looking at temporal coverage. But if you're going to enter a date, make sure again that you go back to the ISO standard 8601 and that you're entering it in a standard format. Now, in all likelihood, you may not be using this field, temporal coverage, as a date field in the true sense that it would be searched by date. You may choose to just leave it as a text field, but what you want is consistency in your metadata. So you want to make sure that even if you're not going to be searching it as a date, that you're entering it in a consistent format. Okay, moving to description. The description is an account of the resource, and generally it's a free text field. This is a field that is generally one of great importance to end users, but how much information you will include in this field is going to depend upon your institution's best practices as well as the needs of a given collection. Some of your collections will likely call for a more robust description than others will. So this, you can see quite a bit of variation within an institution across its collections. As we saw last week, the description field, 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, the description field has 2 refinements: table of contents and abstract. Remember that because consistent data entry may mean the difference between locating related resources and losing those resources in an online database, just simply because they can't be effectively retrieved by you. Okay, so the description, this is an account of the resource. So what is it? What do you see when you look at that photograph? This is generally a free text field. It is one field of really great importance to end users. That's where they're going to learn a lot about the image. How much information you will include, it's going to depend upon your institution's best practices, as well as the needs of a given collection. Some collections will likely call for a more robust description than others. A couple things to keep in mind when you're entering data into the description field, and we've talked about this one already, and that is watching for duplication of information that is included in other fields. So if you're putting dates in elsewhere in the record, generally don't put them in the description field. One caveat to that, and this is one that I believe Dan mentioned 2 weeks ago, is if you have a precise date then and your metadata template, looking at the PDHC that Dan was talking about, in the PDHC and the date field, they only list a year. So you can list 2012. But if you know that this image was taken on June 6, 2012, well, then that's information that you could put in the description field. But I wouldn't want to say this 2012 image when in fact the date field already says 2012. We just don't want to be redundant. The biggest problem that we have with the description field, or our greatest challenge, is because it is a free text field, it is ripe for typographical errors. And you know, a lot of it depends on the description, your resources, you know, can you have somebody review these? You know, what is your quality assurance practice going to be? The experience of the person entering the metadata, this all has impact on how typo-free, basically, that metadata is going to be in the description field. Now, there are a couple of best practices guidelines that you should probably be aware of when entering information in this field. You want to be careful with extraneous punctuation. Stay away from things like ellipses. Stay away from abbreviations. Oftentimes, audiences beyond who you thought, of course, were going to be your primary audience for the material, may come into contact with the collection. And if you're using abbreviations that are only understood by a small subset, then it's going to cause a lot of frustration for other people that might, in fact, find value in working with your collections. So really be careful with abbreviations. Only use those that are most common. And sometimes what you think as being a very common abbreviation it may in fact be a common abbreviation, but may have negative implications for systems. So let's say that you create a metadata record and you enter into the description field Sacramento, comma, the postal abbreviation for California, which is capital C, capital A. Somebody searching for in that collection might look for Sacramento, comma, C-A-L-I-F period, or they might be looking Sacramento, comma, and then California spread out. Well, even if they enter both of those, they're not, unless they know that California is being entered as capital C, capital A, they're not going to find the materials that may be of value to them that you just published. So be really, really careful with abbreviations. It's generally advised that you follow the kind of grammatical rules of the main language in which the resource exists when you're entering descriptive information. And so we see sometime in the description field some brevity that causes a lot of confusion. There won't be complete sentences. I've seen some description fields that have been almost like bulleted lists. This doesn't make for the best user experience. Remember, we're trying as much as possible, number one, to have our collections found, but also for them to be understood easily by our users. And so you want to make sure that you're writing in complete sentences and that you're using those basic grammar rules, you know, sentences start with a capital and end with a period, that kind of thing. And an ampersand. Make sure to spell out, unless, say, you have a title that includes an ampersand, you want to go ahead and write out and. Be aware of these kinds of abbreviations as well. I mentioned capitalization. In general, you want to, of course, capitalize the first word of a title and proper names, and also subject terms. But capitalizing information in the content or description, or capitalizing content in the description field, again, you want to do that according to normal rules of writing. The last thing I want to mention are those brackets. So remember when we talked about the title field, I told you that even though common cataloging practice is if you derive a title, if you create a title and it wasn't on the material, it wasn't a given title, that you would put it in brackets, and I told you, no, don't do that for this. Number one, most of our stuff would be in brackets, but it causes problems for systems. Well, another situation where we often use brackets is if you find a misspelling on information that has, say, perhaps been written on the back of a photograph, and you might use the SIC to indicate that there's, you know, a spelling problem. You can do this, but remember that, again, it can have a big impact on searching and indexing. It's so hard to know. You may come to have a fairly good understanding of how your system works and reacts with those, but you won't always know how other systems deal with them. So now we're going to switch gears again a little bit. We're going to talk about controlled vocabularies. Now, Dan worked with us the week before last on Library of Congress subject headings, a controlled vocabulary, and gave you some great information about how to make use of that resource. But what I'd like to do this week is kind of back that up a bit and take a more general look at controlled vocabularies. So a controlled vocabulary in the broadest sense is really any standardized list of terms that have been selected for consistent use in describing or indexing information resources. Now, controlled vocabularies can also include synonym and ambiguity control, as well as semantic relationships and cross-references across and among terms. The controlled vocabulary works by kind of inserting this interpretive layer of semantics between the term that's entered by the user and the underlying database. And this is to better represent the kind of the original intention of the terms of the users. So controlled vocabularies allow the grouping, the gathering, the collocation of resources that share really one or more significant characteristics, such as, all being about the same topic, the same place, or photographed by the same person. But it is only when metadata creators enter consistent standardized values into metadata fields that search and browse can successfully function in this way for users. So look at what happens when inconsistent values are entered into this field. And we saw this 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, when I asked you to describe an image, and we took a look at the values that were entered, and we didn't even put them in specific metadata fields, but you were just kind of describing what you saw as keyword really entries. And we had a lot of great terms, but there wasn't a lot of consistency. And so here's another example of this. So in this case, there are inconsistent values that got entered into this type of resource field. Notice differences not only in terminology, but also in punctuation and capitalizations. Computers are very literal, and they interpret each of these as a different term. The result is both user confusion and the inability of the user to be able to limit their retrieval sets to, say, all textual or all still image resources. This is why consistent use of controlled terms is so important. So let's look now at the options that are available to us when considering controlled vocabularies. First, however, we need to review the first two characteristics that I mentioned, ambiguity and synonym controls, and then we'll take a look at hierarchical and associative relationships. Remember that ambiguity refers to the fact that the same word or name can refer to different concepts. It can also be different places, different persons, different things. Trailer, the kind you tow, and the trailer that lets you see all of the good scenes or the scenes worth seeing in a movie to entice you to buy a ticket. These are both trailers. Controlled vocabularies deal with this confusion by employing kind of a method of disambiguation. That is, there's a means of differentiating between the different terms. A qualifier is often added in parentheses. For example, banks, banks, opening quote or opening parentheses, financial institutions, close parentheses. Banks, open parentheses, containers, close parentheses. For the names of people, birth and death dates are often added as a way to distinguish one individual from another. Synonymy refers to the opposite problem in natural language, the fact that more than one word or phrase can represent the same concept, the same place, the same person, or the same thing. The terms that you see on the screen there, peanuts, earth nuts, goober peas, and monkey nuts, are all variant names, but for the same type of nut. These terms are in what we refer to as equivalent or equivalence relationships with one another. Controlled vocabularies then provide synonym control by identifying and explicitly linking terms together for users. In most cases, one term will be identified as the preferred term used in metadata, and the others will be cross-references or links to that term. And we saw some of that in LCSH. In traditional controlled vocabularies, the user would be directed to see or use the preferred term. In newer interfaces, the users may be directly presented with the preferred term as an active hyperlink, or may be directly taken to the result using the preferred term. Now, many kinds of controlled vocabularies go beyond synonym control and ambiguity control to arrange terms in a hierarchical relationships of broader and narrower terms. Hierarchies are one method of grouping large numbers of terms into categories that make them kind of easier to navigate and can in fact be used for online browsers and also navigation by searchers. This is something that is used by the majority of e-commerce websites. You'll see today is the primary method of organizing their products into browsable categories and subcategories. So your example, you have a couple of them here. One is, sewing machine, machine sewing serger, but also if you go to like the Lands' End website, you can go to children and then go to girls and then go to outerwear jackets. So these are all methods of organizing their products into browsable, these browsable categories and subcategories. Some controlled vocabularies also include other kinds of relationships among, say, concepts, sometimes places, people, and things that are likely to be of interest to users. These types of semantic relationships that are neither equivalent synonyms nor hierarchical. So if you're interested in this, you may be interested in this. They're put under kind of a broad umbrella term of associative relationships. And traditionally, these are indicated as related term, or you'll see capital R, capital T. But in web-based environments, they may just be presented as hyperlinks. So going back to our typology of controlled vocabularies come in many different shapes and sizes, ranging from the very simple lists of a handful of terms to a massive and complex thesauri and subject heading lists consisting of thousands of terms with various kinds of semantic relationships and linkage among the terms within the list. Controlled vocabularies can range from those created locally for a single collection to those created by, large organizations like the Library of Congress and the Getty Research Institute, and they get used universally across the globe. LC subject headings that you worked with 2 weeks ago, they're one of these types. So lists. A list consists of a controlled list of terms, that is, names for concepts or people or places or events and such that have been selected as established forms to be used in metadata records. Lists may include ambiguity control by adding qualifiers to terms as needed to disambiguate them from otherwise what would seem like identical terms, but they do not include full-fledged synonym control, that is linking, the linking of a synonymous term to another. The list is probably the most commonly used form of a controlled vocabulary in a majority of cultural heritage digital collections, and 2 reasons for this. First, a relatively large number of metadata elements are better served by lists than by more complex vocabularies. That is, elements such as resource type, which we looked at a few minutes ago, genre, format, languages, audience. These typically use flat lists as their source of terms. The second reason for their popularity is that, frankly, many of the current digital asset management systems, they don't have the capability of integrating more complex vocabularies into the navigation and their display structures. In addition to nationally and internationally established lists of terms, many institutions create their own list of terms. Many develop a list of topical terms at a much more detailed level of coverage of a subject content that can be found in, say, an established thesauri or subject heading list. A synonym ring is a set of terms selected to be treated as equivalent For the purposes, again, of search engine retrieval within a website, they form a ring because none of the terms is selected as the preferred or authorized term. They are all equivalent to one another. Our example of peanuts, earth nuts, goober peas, and monkey nuts could be considered and entered as a synonym ring. Now, synonym rings are different from the other kinds of controlled vocabulary in that the terms are not used in metadata records, but they are entered into search engine software, and for this reason, I'd like you to be aware of them. So they kind of lie outside of metadata per se, but they do fall in the spectrum of controlled vocabularies, and you see them being used more and more. So I just want you to be aware of their existence. Now, a taxonomy or a classification scheme, they can be viewed from one perspective as basically a list of established terms arranged into hierarchical categories of broader and narrower, or you might also refer to it as parent and child terms. The term taxonomy can refer to a very rigorous and formal classification scheme, or it can be a loose hierarchical scheme used for organizing and navigating something like a website, or to many types of uses and schemas in between. One of the value of taxonomies or classification schemes for digital collections is that they can be used for user browsing, allowing the users to drill down from a small set of broad categories into increasingly more specific subcategories. So, starting with that type of image, now I want to see moving images, or now I want to see still images. That doesn't go down very far, but it's just an example of how we start from something very broad, and then we can continue to drill down. And our Land's End example there a few minutes ago was the same kind of thing. Once again, though, most current digital collection software is not able to make use of hierarchical relationships for this kind of sophisticated browsing. Now, the full-fledged thesaurus is the most complex of the controlled vocabularies in that it includes all of our identified types of semantic relationships. So thesauri are usually focused on a particular subject area, be it broad or narrow, such as the Library of Congress, thesaurus for graphic materials, also the thesaurus for geographic names, and art and architecture, the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus. All three of these we use in cultural heritage metadata, and they are established thesauri. This network of linked relationships and cross-references is called syndetic structure in traditional library cataloging language. It is kind of a network of, or a web of, semantic relationships. When these terms are used in metadata for digital objects and the links among the terms are able to be fully implemented by database software, it presents users with these linkages not only among the terms themselves, but among all of the resources in the database represented by these terms. Some digital collections, like the U.S. Department of Agriculture collection here on the screen, they're able to fully incorporate a subject thesaurus and use these kinds of linkages for user display and really dynamic navigation. But alas, most systems today can't do this. Subject heading lists are lists of controlled subject terms that may also include any or all of the semantic relationships that we've just talked about. Subject headings are, however, often distinguished from thesauri for several reasons, although the dividing lines are sometimes far from absolute. First, most thesauri cover a more specific or restricted subject domain, whereas subject headings like LCSH, as we saw 2 weeks ago, they cover the entire range of human knowledge, since it's intended for the collections of the Library of Congress, which potentially encompass virtually any and every topic in the subject domain. Second, most thesauri consist of single word terms, or they at least restrict the use of compound multi-word terms, whereas subject heading lists tend to be more varied in this regard and often include inverted terms and other term forms generally that are avoided in thesauri. You know, think poetry, modern, in contrast to modern poetry, or as Dan mentioned in his discussion with us, architecture domestic. Third, most thesauri do not allow for subdivisions to be added to terms, which is very common in subject heading lists. But again, the lines here can be rather fuzzy. For example, the thesaurus for graphic materials does allow for subdivisions, except that it allows only for geographic subdivisions and has a narrower topic domain than the Library of Congress subject headings does. Well, if you just look at the title, that makes sense, right? Thesaurus for graphic materials and Library of Congress subject headings. Obviously, TGM is going to be smaller in scope than LCSH is. So here are kind of the most commonly recommended controlled vocabularies and what they are used for. So you'll see in the first column there for type, for format, for material, for genre, also for technique. You could look at art and architecture, Dublin Core Metadata Initiative type vocabulary, thesaurus for graphic materials, and the internet list. Names and roles, we have Library of Congress authority file. We have MARC relator terms. Remember, we talked about those last week. So Joe Smith was the photographer or the editor. So their role, and also the union list of artist names. For subject, we've looked at LCSH, but know that there is also art and architecture, thesaurus for geographic names, and also thesaurus for graphic materials. And then classification of subject, of course, we have Dewey Decimal and Library of Congress.